Hello, welcome to week 6 for multimedia design. This week we're digging into 2D animation. The objectives for this week are to describe the history and concepts of 2D animation, create some 2D animation using animation software, and then we're going to talk about advantages and disadvantages of using traditional animation techniques. So let's dig into that a little bit. What is animation? Eugene Levinson described it as single frame cinematography. Charles Solomon described it as the illusion of motion that is created rather than recorded. One of the most famous definitions comes from Norman McLaren, who was the founder of the animation department at the National Film Board of Canada. He describes it as the following: animation is not the art of drawings that move, but the art of movements that are drawn. What happens between each frame is more important than what exists on each frame. So animation is therefore the art of manipulating the invisible space that lies between the frames. So let's look at some early animation devices, the first of which is a thaumatrope. This is a toy that was made popular in Victorian times. Essentially, it was a disc or a card with a picture on each side, and it was attached to two pieces of string. When the strings are twirled quickly between the fingers, the two pictures appear to combine into a single image due to persistence of vision. The zoetrope, on the other hand, is a device that produces the illusion of motion from a rapid succession of static pictures, as we can see here in this example on the bottom right. Another animation device is the flip book. The technique for creating a flip book is to create still images showing a different stage of motion on each page. The pages are then flipped in rapid succession to view that motion. So the basics within this idea is that you get a quality of motion in the rate of the display. Onion skinning is used to draw one image and then the succession of images that follow. And registration physically aligns the images with one another, as we can see here with the book. Once they're all connected into one book and we start to flip, they're registered so that it feels like the illusion of motion as we flip through. Challenges in traditional animation are really in the number of images that have to be created for traditional animation. There's 24 frames per second, which requires 1,440 individual still images for each frame or each minute of animation. The methods of generating these images include shooting on twos, which helps to decrease the amount of drawings, but can have a adverse effect in that it could start to make the animation feel choppy. The cycling of images can be used. For example, you may reuse a walk cycle if it's the same exact motion that you need from one scene to the next. And holds are used to produce a sequence of identical drawings. And what that does is that with the hold is it's to extend a state or an action. So for example, if you wanted to, for timing's sake, capture an emotion and hold on that, you can use that hold technique, and that also extends the frames that you have to draw, or lessens the amount of frames you have to draw, I should say. So with animation, we need to have an awareness of how things move in the world, and we can do that through the principles of animation. The first of which is squash and stretch. The purpose is to give a sense of weight and flexibility to drawn objects. It can be applied to simple objects like a bouncing ball, or more complex constructions like the musculature of a human face. The most important aspect of this principle is the fact that the object's volume does not change when squashed or stretched. As you can see here in Preston Blair's example, we don't see a volume change when we're stretching or squashing on the ball, or on the frog, or on the character here that's diving into the water. The next principle is anticipation. Anticipation is used to prepare the audience for an action and to make the action appear realistic. As we can see here, Richard Williams has done a fantastic job showing us how a man is going to jump off of a diving board. We see him walking, and the anticipation happens here when we start to see him bend down and getting ready to jump. We know at this point he's going to jump. We also know here that he's going to jump off. We also see that in Preston Blair's example over here on the right, where we see the rabbit revving up to punch this dog in the face. Another area of anticipation is it really starts here in pose number 2 and builds up until we hit him right into the face. The next principle is staging. This is akin to staging as it is known in theater and film. The purpose is to direct the audience attention and make it clear what is of importance in the scene. The essence of the principle is keeping focus on what is relevant and avoiding unnecessary detail. The next principle is straight ahead and action and pose to pose. These are two different approaches to the actual drawing process or animation process. Straight ahead action means drawing out a scene frame by frame from beginning to end, while pose to pose involves starting with a drawing of a few keyframes and then filling the intervals in later. These intervals are referred to as in-betweens or tweens in animation. So the examples that I have here are from Preston Blair, and you can see here on just the simple movement of the sphere, the darkened poses or frames are the keys, and then the lighter ones are the in-betweens. So if you're doing pose to pose, you draw these first three keys, and then you do the tweens or the in-betweens between the keys. If you're doing straight ahead action, you're drawing this pose, then this pose, then this pose, then this pose, then this pose, and then on into the end of the animation. The next principle is follow through and overlapping action. These closely related techniques help render movement more realistically and give the impression that characters follow the laws of physics. Follow through means that separate parts of the body will continue to move after the character has stopped. As you can see here, that's happening with the squirrel when the squirrel lands and the hind end follows through. The tail also follows through. Overlapping action is a tendency for the body parts to move at different rates. So for example, the arm will move at different timing than the head. A third technique called the drag is where a character starts to move and the parts of him take a few frames to catch up, as is seen here when the front quarter of the squirrel lands first and then the hind quarter will land a few frames later. The next principle is slow in and slow out. The movement of the human body and most other objects needs time to accelerate and slow down. For this reason, animation looks more realistic if it has more drawings near the beginning and the end of an action, emphasizing the extreme poses and fewer in the middle, as you can see here in this simple example of a sphere moving on an arc here, or as seen here. Slow out, slow in and out. The next principle is arcs. Most natural action tends to follow an arced trajectory. An animation should adhere to this principle by following implied arcs for greater realism. This can apply to a limb moving or a rotating joint or a thrown object moving around a parabolic trajectory. The exception is mechanical movement, which typically moves in straight lines, something that you might see with a robot. An object in motion that moves out of its natural arc for no apparent reason will feel erratic rather than fluid. The next principle is secondary action. Adding secondary action to the main action gives a scene more life and can help support the main action. A person walking simultaneously can swing his arms or keep them in his pockets. He can speak or whistle, or he can express emotions through facial expressions. The important thing about secondary actions is that they emphasize rather than take attention away from the main action. Notice the dog grabbing the butterfly with the primary action of his arms. His hips and torso are part of the primary action. His feet and tail are secondary to his hips and torso. This principle is also evident in the dog's head, which swings from his arms as part of the primary action, and his ears follow as secondary action. The next principle is timing, and this refers to the number of drawings or frames for a given action, which translates to the speed of the action on film. On a purely physical level, correct timing makes an object appear to abide by the laws of physics. For instance, an object's weight decides how it reacts to an impetus, like a push. Timing is critical for establishing a character's mood, emotion, and reaction. It can also be a device to communicate aspects of the character's personality. The next principle is exaggeration. This is an effect that is especially useful in animation, as perfect imitation of reality can look static and dull in cartoons. The level of exaggeration depends on whether one seeks realism or a particular style, like a caricature of a style of an artist. The classical definition of exaggeration employed by Disney was to remain true to reality, just presenting it in a wilder, more extreme form. And as you can see here, here's just a normal unexaggerated pose of a guy throwing a baseball. But if we push that pose, the arc in the pose, it feels more exaggerated. And then from the Rabbit of Seville here, an extreme exaggerated facial expression in a pose from our dear rabbit. The next principle is solid drawing. This means taking into account forms in three-dimensional space, giving them volume and weight. The animator needs to be a skilled draftsman and has to understand the basics of three-dimensional shapes, anatomy, weight, balance, light, and shadow. And finally, we are at the last principle, which is appeal. Appeal in a cartoon character corresponds to what we call charisma in an actor. A character who is appealing is not necessarily sympathetic. Villains or monsters can also be appealing. The important thing is that the viewer feels the character is real and interesting. As we can see here in the two sides of the coin, we have the heroine and the villain here from Sleeping Beauty. They are both visually appealing and have charisma and character that's interesting to look at and watch. Strategies for achieving motion have been applied to paper cutouts, as we see here in this example, clay figurines, puppets, or even natural objects that are photographed and reposed and rephotographed, which is similar to what you see with puppets and claymation. Cell animation was perfected by the Disney Studios. Cells are drawings of individual frames made on sheets of celluloid. Drawings were then photographed to produce the animated film. This technique is directly influenced and has developed the age of digital animation. And as we can see here, this is the actual multiplane camera that was created for Walt Disney Studios. And here's a quick graphic of how that was utilized in the studio. Some of the advantages from cell animation were that artists saved time drawing. It gave them precise control over the elements. It encouraged division of labor and promoted high artistic standards. Master artists would draw the keyframes or extremes, and the assistants would draw the tweens or the in-betweens. Inkers transferred drawings from paper to celluloid. Opakers applied colors to the celluloid. And then there were additional specialists such as producers, directors, scriptwriters, audio specialists, camera operators, checkers, and so on. Producing cell animation can be costly and complex when creating animation. Some areas that we need to talk about here are the process in which it was created. The first stage of which is the storyboard, which is a sequence of drawings that story artists would sketch out to map out the story that was going to be told. The next step in the process is getting into the animation of the film. And what happens during that process is artists will do what's called a pencil test, which is a series of simple sketches that are photographed and projected so that you can test out the believability of the animation, check to see if the story is working properly, this type of thing. But let's hop over and take a quick look at a pencil test that was created for Beauty and the Beast. I've got YouTube pulled up, so let's go ahead and I'm going to pull that up and we'll just take a quick look at a Beauty and the Beast pencil test that I've got here. You won't hear the sound, but you can see exactly what I mean by the sketch quality and devising the storytelling and using this as a tool to tell the story. So let's just look at that for a minute. As you can see here, this is the sketches that are utilized in the animation before they go to final stages. There's some background elements that are placed in behind the characters. But this is just a test to see, am I believing this story? Is it working? All right, so let's keep going here. The next step is creating a scratch track, which is an audio track with voiceovers. Now that may not necessarily mean the actual actors that are playing the characters. It could be the artists that are drawing the animation so that they could time it to the audio track that they plan to use at some point. And then of course there's the animatic reel. So let's take a look at some animatic reels so you can get a better idea. I think it helps to visually see what that looks like so you can understand more about why we would use it. So let's jump over to YouTube again. This first one is from, I'm trying to frame this up here. This first one is from Ratatouille. And it's the opening sequence for the movie. I'm trying to grab, sorry. My apologies. There we go. Trying to get that play button. So here we're just seeing the opening sequence coming in. Obviously you won't hear the audio as I'm placing my audio over this so we can talk and learn more about this. But these are cutouts, and we're trying to figure out, is this sequence working? Is it, it feels choppy because it should be choppy. It's not fluid animation at this point. We're just trying to see if the story's working. Is this going to be a good opening sequence? What do we need to change to make it stronger? That's kind of what we're doing with an animatic, is we're seeing if all these parts that we've worked out in the storyboards are working to tell the story that we need to tell. Another one I have up from Despicable Me. Let's see if we can take a look at the difference. This one's very rough in terms of background and value. And rough meaning very simple is what I'm trying to say here. But we're trying to figure out, is the storytelling strong? What do we need to do to fix and change it? This one's great in terms of adding just simple two-tone lighting. But as you can see, an animatic really can help to help you decipher what's working and what's not in the piece. And then you can go back to the board without spending a lot of time on animation or wasting time on animation that you may not use. Let's go back to... Also, with producing cell animation, we need to think about the equipment that was used in the process. There were specialized paints to convey proper hue, specialized camera and lighting to capture the cells. We used devices to track changes in paths of animation, align and hold the cells for camera shots, and then synchronize and edit the final film. Lots of work was done to pull an animated feature together in respect to cell animation. So with digital animation, there's two forms. 2D evolved from traditional animation techniques. 3D exploited capabilities unique to the computer. And here's just a quick example of 2D animation of Yogi Bear and a 3D version of Yogi Bear. So 2D animation is produced by mimicking basic traditional techniques such as the flip book, the cutout technique, rotoscoping, cell animation, paint and draw programs were used to create the components. And then animation software can sequence timing and transitions and produce the final animation. Here's just a quick screen grab of the Flash interface and how we can see that these techniques have been utilized and can be utilized in Flash today. So digital cell animations, they're a series of individual frames. They're synchronized to one or more soundtracks. Graphics are arranged on layers, much like we saw that multi-plane camera. We're just utilizing an interface such as Flash to use layers like the multi-plane camera. Major changes identified in keyframes, of course, and the illusion of motion is produced as a series of tweens. So you're spending most of your time working on the keys and you're adding tweens instead of creating those in-between drawings. Of course, you can still do that to create more fluid animation, but you can also use tweens to make your time spent a little bit more efficient. So let's take a look at the interface of Flash. I know this is a really small image of the interface, but it's just some quick uh, ideas on where you find things in the Flash interface. Here on the timeline, it's a horizontal row of frames. So we've got the timeline up here. The frames are within the timeline, and then layers, our layer stack is right here. And that's where what we would use for the stacking of different elements, such as background to characters to foreground, those types of things. Keyframes are defined. They define the major changes in the timeline. And here I created a sphere and created 3 keyframes. And then I turned on onion skinning. This is the onion skinning toggle. And what this is doing here is, because I've turned on the onion skinning toggle, I can see, even though I'm on frame 1 in the timeline, I can see the other keys that I've created, and they're set up at different values because of the onion skinning. And I can align things up a little bit easier when I turn that on. That's the beauty of using the onion skinning, and as I can align my animation and make it feel more fluid, as opposed to guessing as I go down the timeline in terms of where do I place this ball. I may have placed this one up a little bit higher on accident or lower on accident, but if I turn on onion skin, I can make those adjustments very easily. A tween is a tool that you can add, or it's basically creating the interpoling between these 2 keys. So if I have these 3 keys on my timeline, then I can right click between the 2 of them, and I can choose to add a tween to that, basically. I mean, there's a little bit more finessing that you do once you get into Flash, but that's the long and short of it. Is I'm creating a tween to create more fluid animation between the 2 keys. Let's take a look at something that will help to understand onion skinning a little bit more. And I've just grabbed this image of this rabbit where onion skinning is evident, because I can see more than those 3 frames that we saw here in this Flash interface image. These are, say, 10, maybe 5 to 7 frames of animation, but you can see onion skin is turned on, and you can see frame 1, frame 2, frame 3, frame 4, as we go through. And so having that turned on helps to create more consistency in the drawing that you're trying to create. And then this is just a quick breakdown of the interface, again, with a lot more complex animation. Your tools that you use, the keyframes you can see a little bit easier. This is an older version of Flash in this image. The timeline, the layers that you're going to use for animation in Flash. Another form of creating animation is programming the animation. And with programming animation, there are some advantages. The animator essentially creates commands and the computer generates the animation. This requires a knowledge of programming and mathematical techniques to specify that motion. But the great advantages are the file sizes are smaller, the animation loads and plays faster, it reduces bandwidth and processor demands, it supports complex forms of interactivity. And some of the scripting languages that are utilized in programmed animations are Lingo, ActionScript, and JavaScript. So let's talk about the assignments really quickly for week 6. The reading assignment is chapter 9. You're going to read pages 197 through 208. You want to read the online lecture notes titled The Basics of Animation and 2D Animation. In discussion, we're talking about traditional animation. For your written assignment, you're going to do a 2D animation, and in your All About Me project, you're going to animate your name. So let's look a little closer at those. For discussion, you are going to talk about what do you think the major disadvantages are for traditional animation, and what can you do to overcome those challenges and disadvantages. Are there any advantages to using traditional animation, and talk about why you think that. For your written assignment, you're going to apply the concepts and fundamentals of 2D animation to produce your own animation. You're going to follow these steps. Using the internet or one of your own photographs, select an image of an animal that you want to animate. If there is a background in the image, well, I'm sure that there will be a background. You want to use a design program such as Photoshop to cut your animal out and then bring that into Flash. I also recommend breaking the animal up in terms of maybe you're going to remove the background and then also separate the limbs from the torso and then place that into Flash and then animate those independently so it feels like they're moving. That will create a little bit more complexity for you, but it can be kind of fun. It'll feel like the paper cutout type of animation. And then you're going to animate that, and I recommend using Flash for that. You're going to use tweens so that you can create fluid animation, and your animal should move from one side of the screen to the other. You're going to save it in your Flash file format and then submit that to the Dropbox. For your All About Me project, you're going to create a 2D animation of your name, and it should use at least one tween. You know, I'm telling you here, the instructions are telling you that you can use a motion tween, a shape tween, you can use a graphic or a still image. What I'd like to see is that you're using tweens. I'm not concerned about which type of tween that you use. I want to see that you understand the principles of animation and that you're creating some fluid animation with your piece. My suggestion to you is to use Flash. That's where you're going to get tweens. Otherwise, you can use After Effects, which tweens are not necessarily the right terminology. I will be creating something to demonstrate how to use both of these arenas so that you have an understanding of which way to go or are excited by one or the other. So keep your eyes peeled for that. But again, for this project, you're going to animate your name. And you want to think about ways that you're going to use that in your All About Me project. So when you're thinking about this, you should be doing some thumbnails or boards, figuring out how you're going to use your name and animate your name in your overall All About Me project. Now, if you're creating something that is you're essentially going to render this out as a video file that you're going to embed into your InDesign document that you're creating, or your website if you're doing a website. So remember that it's not something that you will be able to manipulate inside of InDesign. It is something that you will embed into InDesign. Okay? All right, so that is all I have for you this week, and keep your eyes peeled for that demo.